Well, I'm here with Alex Kaschuta for another exploration on things hidden. We've had her on before to talk about Rene Girard and liberalism and a whole host of different things like we always do. So, welcome back, Alex.
Thank you for having me, David.
So, since we last talked, you've been really, it's been exciting to see more and more people engage your work and seeing you do articles on various topics. And I ran across your piece here in American Mind called Court Jesters, which I thought had an interesting angle because we've become so obsessed with being excited about anytime a liberal comedian says something nominally critical of the establishment narratives that we're supposed to be in awe and adoration of. But you kind of point out that that's not really necessarily a good thing when that's all we can get excited about. Would you unpack this article a little bit, Court Jesters?
Yeah, of course, because I was just seeing a lot of people, like you said, being very excited about the fact that not only did I think Dave Chappelle be a little bit more aggressive against kind of the trans phenomenon, but now Ricky Gervais has this whole special where he is very transphobic within the parameters set out by the regime. My argument is that this might be a good sign, but it is most probably actually just a sign of the regime kind of funneling the energies created by this the fact that this is such a ridiculous affront to reality that essentially the emperor is so naked and so visibly and like I said ridiculously obvious to everyone that these energies need to be funneled back into the mainstream. And what tells me that this is essentially a diversion rather than an actual confrontation of the phenomenon is that in the special itself, Ricky Gervais takes pains to say that trans rights are human rights, and to essentially make all the necessary, nods to the regime to say, okay, I actually do accept the premise of what trans activists are doing, but I do quibble with some of the extremists, some of the people that just go too far for my tastes or for the taste of the public. Because you can see, if there's like some grotesque man in a dress trying to do striptease in front of a I don't know 8-year-old, then your average person will be appalled by this. So this is the type of event that is perfect for comedy, and someone will exploit that, and there's a lot of energy to make fun of that. But the reality is that after the comedy special is done, and everyone's had their laughs, they're all going home, and they're still on the very steep, slippery slope that's been slipping for decades, and that we're all on, and there's not really any actual questioning of the core metaphysics here, because it's like, oh, if trans rights are human rights, well, okay, which of these trans rights are human rights? Because the problem that I have with trans is that it is essentially a metaphysical system that was imposed without any sort of questioning, without any sort of negotiation with the public. It was just brought here and said, okay, this is this is what it is. We even have science to back us. There's a lot of science backing the essentially this metaphysical claim that you can have this uncomfortable meat suit that needs modifications like it's a race car. This isn't a scientific claim. This is essentially a metaphysical claim, and it's been smuggled into the culture. And now what people like Gervais and Chappelle are doing are just like negotiating over some final details, but they're not actually questioning the core premise. Trans rights aren't human rights. This is a huge metaphysical claim that's not even begun to be discussed, and now we're like 100 yards down the road, and we're negotiating over what type of child needs hormone therapy. When do you get to have a mastectomy so that you can transform into your final form or whatever.
Yeah, he said that
Discourses.
statement, didn't he? He said trans rights. That's what he said.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
he
So
was.
there's
That's like he was reciting the creed. He was like saying, "Look, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, Maker of heaven and earth." But isn't it funny how that one idea about the Trinity is a little strange? I mean, how could Jesus possibly have counted the crystals on Saturn's rings while he was an infant in his mother's arm? That's basically what he was doing, right? you know.
exactly.
giving credit to the creed, but yet saying, I think it's a little goofy, don't you, on some little parts of it, right?
Yeah, and the reality is that on Netflix, that's pretty much as you can do. But the fact that you can do that shouldn't really surprise us, because
Why?
we are confronted with something that, your average person really has trouble processing, because the speed of the permanent revolution is accelerating, and you need these little release valves to kind of make this stuff palatable, because nothing really changes after the special is done. It's, we're still trans rights.
Well, how
All
far would it have to be? How far? How would the humor be different? Well, okay, how do I say this? How would the humor have to be different to not be that? To not be controlled opposition to the established narrative? To be subversive satire that actually is dangerous to the king? How would
Yeah,
that
I
look?
think without the nods to it, without the because essentially what Ricky Gervais does in the special is, it's called Supernature, and it's very much kind of a general anti-metaphysics special. I don't know if you've watched it. It's
I
essentially,
did, yeah.
yeah, so it's trying to, it's, Ricky Gervais is a famous atheist. He just, tries to play the card that he is someone who is irrational, who is beyond all metaphysics. He just, looks at reality as it is, and just, pokes holes in various narratives. And he doesn't really need a personal metaphysics. He just, kind of coasts along, and engages with reality as things come to him rationally. I think the problem with that is that that's essentially the metaphysics that brought us to trans rights, that brought us to the it's kind of a social libertarian instinct that brought us to this point where it's kind of to each his own, live and let live. Whatever you want to do with, this body that is in your ownership, you kind of have property rights over your body, is fine. And essentially, that's the position that Gervais has as well. The problem with that is that to oppose trans rights in any sort of sufficient way would be to have an opposing, at least as strong metaphysical claim to make about what it is to be human, what it is to engage with reality. And the problem is that Gervais's position is not only weak, but it is essentially the recipe that brought us here. So
Mhm.
he's completely disarmed to it, except for noting almost instinctively that this is absurd and this is crazy. But that's what people said, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and they're forgotten in the winds of time because a permanent revolution has moved forward, disregarding all sorts of weak pushback.
So, you see that also with like Dave Chappelle's special, that everybody was talking about. I saw one conservative friend of mine said this was like a big founding moment in our culture. This was like the George Washington's inaugural address, or something. It was like this big moment where he challenged the trans community too a little bit. But if you looked at that, he did the kind of same thing Ricky did, where he said, "Well, he had to tip his hat to the dogmas and the creeds. He had to recite the creeds before he did a little bit of elbowing, right?
Yeah, I
Same
mean,
phenomenon."
yeah, I really don't think you could, you're going to get to Netflix if you don't. That's probably even in the contract. You need to
We,
at least nod to the creed.
but even people who are not, I don't know, like Jimmy Dore, he's more anti-establishment than Netflix. But even Jimmy Dore, I went and saw him when he came to my area in the Tampa Bay area, and it was good stuff. His comedy routine, but he had to say the same stuff. He had to do the same exact thing. He said, "Well, look, he had to give the whole, you do whatever you want, and I'm on board with all the LGBTQIA plus." And then once he said that, then he went and he was allowed to do a little bit of digging at some of the extreme versions of their ideology. So that
Yeah.
seems to be kind of even for people who are, and then I guess I remember Tim Dillon. I saw him, and he kind of had to do a similar thing. He's a little bit more anti-establishment, but he would say like, "Well, I got the shot, but raise your hand if you got Johnson and Johnson. The people raise their hand. Okay, those guys are going to die in a few days, and stuff like that. So, but he had to still say, I did what the authorities told me to do. Now I get to make fun of some of it about it, right? So that tends to be a pattern we see even in the most effective satirists of our time, right?
Yeah, I mean the kind of the ethos of comedy, to kind of justify itself in a way has to be the social libertarianism where it's to each his own. It kind of also justifies the fact that we can say whatever we want. That's kind of the political outlook that most comedians will have, and I feel like that's also why it's tolerated, because it's a very defanged type of position as well. It's like, to each their own, but also in our society at the moment, there is a very virulent cultural strain that is exerting power in a massive way, and there are other things that are just not important, like whatever right wing faction you try to inhabit. So to each their own essentially leaves society up for grabs to the most powerful, to the people who think that they have the right to rule. And at the moment, the people who think they have the right to rule are people on the left, or people who, believe that transgenderism is not only right, but it is common sense. It is the right side of history. It's essentially kind of this implicit morality that's snuck in. It's not a religion in a explicit way, but it considers itself just common sense. This is the direction that society has to go, because this is progress. In the past people were savages, now we're kind of okay, but we're still oppressing people. The future utopia is gonna come in once everyone is free to inhabit their authentic self, and the direction of the authentic self is always, it seems, now mediated through surgeries, through hormones, through any sort of thing, and then maybe in the future also the state might need to pay for it, because how can you be your authentic self if you can't afford mastectomies, electively, or things like that. So the direction is always towards more autonomy, more power for the homunculus in the meat suit to construct, to self-create in the best way that it chooses.
And of course, this all stands in stark contrast to what the concept of the self, as Rene Girard develops in mimetic theory, where he talks about, the idea of you having your desires uniquely from your own heart is the romantic lie of our times, of modernity. And so it's no wonder that his ideas are not quite as in vogue on the left as they should be. But, we have to work on that, because when you think about it, that mimetic theory concept of the self totally undermines the whole project of this self-created person, right? Because if you're sitting there saying, well, I just truly feel in my desires that I need to change, my body or something, what you're doing is you're actually borrowing from something around you or someone around you for the desires that are pulling your heart, right?
Exactly. And that kind of, deeply undermines the social libertarian strain, because, it's the idea that you live and let live, but, that by your actions, your life is essentially kind of a mimetic source for everyone around you. Then you don't really live and let live. You live, and then you mimetically influence whoever is around you, depending on your level of status, depending on, how much of a reach you have, especially now with kind of technologically mediated propagation of all these memes and mimesis. So, we're essentially living in a network of mimesis, and having no responsibility for that. That's kind of what these comedians are saying. I wash my hands of all of this. It's kind of ridiculous, but at the same time, I'm not getting involved. I'm here on the sidelines, just, cracking a joke, saying this or that, but, I have no responsibility for the society in which, children are, getting puberty blockers, getting sterilized for life, just essentially nothing, nothing different from complete mutilation for many of these kids is happening, but, that's no problem of theirs. I'm not saying that Ricky Gervais's life mission is now to save the children or anything like that, but it is a bit. I feel like the people who put too much hope in what's going on there, I don't realize that there's not really a direct mechanism of action here that's going to I don't know, take power from these processes through whatever comedic relief is offered by Gervais and Chappelle.
What have you heard of, like, the comedian Alex Stein? Have you heard of him? He's been coming
No.
around to different town city commissions and school board meetings, and he'll perform like a leftist character, and he'll make it look like it's realistic. Like, he'll go on to a school district meeting, and he'll say, "My daughter identifies as a lizard, and she doesn't need the temperature at 87 degrees, but she does need to have her terrarium in the classrooms available for her to do what she needs to do." And he plays a very straight, he makes it really effective. And a lot of the people are in an uncomfortable position because they have to continually go along with it because they don't want to, violate the rules of their worldview. But he's been effective. People have pointed out on how to do satire right. Are you one of those that would say that humor, because you hear this a lot, in times of authoritarian ideology and tyranny, one of the best tools that people who don't have power can use is humor? Do you believe that, or do you think that's kind of over blown, that idea?
Yeah, no, I think that's true, and I think humor can sway people in very subtle ways because kind of humor is a tool of status. I think status is extremely important in society. Who has status? Who is the either official or unofficial elite that people look up to is very important. And if that elite is kind of dragged down from their pedestals by enough humor, by very well targeted humor, it can be effective. But I guess, we kind of have to think about what exactly is the humor targeting? How much, does it actually pay obedience to the current regime, and what exactly is it that they're trying to tear down? So I think humor can be super effective. But yeah, it depends who is the target and what exactly is the content of the humor.
Yeah, right. Like with Dave Chappelle's critiques on the trans community, it seemed like his basic argument was too many white men or whatever trying to basically supplant the black community as the ultimate victim class in the culture, right? And that's what he was saying. Is like, no, 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 you're not doing that. You don't get to just cut in line and take over our status as ultimate martyrs of this culture. You guys you're just exploiting and taking advantage of your power advantage again. That seemed to be the argument he was making in that
Yeah,
special.
that's a revealing argument in itself for many reasons. But I think that's actually a fairly good argument because the most active campaigners for transgender rights tend to be late in life, male to female, quite, I don't know, strong personality men. As you see, a lot of them are overrepresented in business, in the military, guys who were quite masculine in many ways in their presentation for a long time, and then I don't know, 40 or 50 years old, they decide that they actually felt that they were, I don't know, Bethany inside for their entire lives, and then they turn into a rabid activist type who is, most of the activism you'll see on the internet, except for a few, I don't know, teenage girls, because they're pretty active in themselves, but most of the activism comes from those corners. Someone like Rachel Levine type person, that's quite, or even Caitlyn Jenner in her own way. So yeah, that's an interesting observation, and I feel like in a way I think he's onto something. But it's interesting that he presents it as a turf war, in the sense that there's definitely something to be won there. I don't know if that's him showing his cards a bit too hard,
The
but
turf reminds me of the turfs, like J.K. Rowling and all that. That's
exactly,
another part of
exactly.
this. That's another faction here. It doesn't matter that she normalized witchcraft for generations of kids. They don't give them any thanks, do they? They're like, no, if you're not on board the latest iteration of the revolution, you're out. You are done. Don't care if you
Yeah.
normalized witchcraft for billions of kids.
I think that's also a hope for our side as well. Is that the fact that this permanent revolution is because of the tech enablement of it, and because things go so fast. There's a certain schism of elites that's happening quite fast. Like, you know, someone like J.K. Rowling, you know, best-selling author, probably, I think, of all time or something. You know, she's up there with, you know, extremely popular. She's, you know, made a dent in the culture, you know, gets completely ostracized for very seemingly minor thing, and this is happening again and again and again. And it's happened in Silicon Valley quite a lot. You know, there's a big faction of people who are, you know, so-called based in Silicon Valley. They're, you know, like some like Coinbase, or, you know, people in you know, Thielbucks in the shadows, and they're essentially kind of drifting off from the main cohort of elites. And I think that's a hopeful movement in the sense that it's happening so fast, historically unprecedented, just because of the technological enablement and the fact that the media itself is now fueled by this technological enablement. So the purity spiraling that's happening in the media, you know, the fact that the New York Times, essentially, this is what it exists on. These culture wars, this, you know, who is on our side, who is friend, who is enemy, constant churning conflict between people, you know, Twitter wars between, I don't know, Elon Musk and whoever. So there's a lot of inter-elite conflict happening, and the elites right now, the biggest cohort, is on the side of a lot of ridiculousness. So I think we're pretty well poised to keep cleaving off, you know, people who used to be liberal elites that are moving camp, hopefully, into a different cohort, like kind of a counter elite. How well that counter elite will represent our values, how well these values that, you know, are generalizable to that new cohort will translate into politics, will, you know, actually lead to improvements in, you know, every man's life. That's harder to predict, but dissatisfaction with what's going on, I think, is going to increase, and it's going to increase for a lot of powerful people. I don't know exactly what they're going to align on after they've been dissatisfied. I think that's the question now. So I think we're looking at a few decades of some craziness in both politics and in social trends and things like that. That you know, I mean, there's been craziness. You know, what did you have expected? You know, mastectomies in teenagers 10 years ago? No, that's quite a crazy development. But I feel like similar things might be on the horizon, just because of, you know, how technology speeds everything up and allows these fights to happen visibly and just so frequently.
I remember when I was in college, they were mad at Chick-fil-A or something about supporting family council, or, you know, one of those
Yeah.
pro-marriage groups, and yet the classes that I was taking, they were talking about gender identity and stuff, and I remember thinking, like, oh, this is like, you know, like, I mean, this is going to be on the news, like, this is going to be what people talk about. Like, right now the news is talking about Chick-fil-A and gay marriage, and men are kissing in Chick-fil-A to show their deep protest, but like the stuff I'm learning right now today, where they're talking about, you know, gender identity and children being assigned gender and all these different things, cisgender, that term, I'm like, that's going to be mainstream. Right now it's like, this is an indie thing right now, but it's going to be mainstream in a few years, and that'll be on the news. And I don't know what they'll be teaching. That's why I feel like we need to peek into the classroom to see what they're doing now, and that'll give you a good idea of what's coming in a couple
I
years.
mean,
I know it's happening faster now, the transition, because of social media.
it seems like the logical next step, and the thing that is almost directly downstream from teenage child transition, is a empowering of the rational agent in children. And by
Right.
that,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, children being able to decide for themselves on the basis of their sexual impulses, on the basis of attraction, on the basis of, you know, maybe to engage in child-adult relationships. You know, who are we to say that, you know, the rational individual in children is underdeveloped? You know, this is an oppressive perspective. And they've tried to make this argument in the 1960s. You know, there's that famous, French kind of postmodernist list of signatories where they wanted to abolish the age of consent. Didn't go through quite that smoothly back then, but this is kind of a conversation that's looming underneath the discourse almost at all times. And there's actually my friend Pedro Gonzalez wrote about this very recently, about this case of kind of a Twitter warrior, a guy who was very much involved in, like, don't call transgender people groomers, because there's a whole conversation about calling them groomers because they're bringing this whole sexual element into conversation with children, and he was, I think, primary school teacher in Hawaii,
Yeah.
and he was just apprehended with child pornography that he had co-created, just a whole chest of horrors, and he was one of these keyboard warriors saying that it's oppressive to describe transgender advocates like he was as groomers, when it turns out they're actually groomers. So there's always maybe not always, but there's a lot of correlations in this set, and when you talk about paraphilias, these kind of sexual fetishes and things like that, they rarely travel alone. If you have one, you might have multiple, and empowering people like this to deliver sexual education to children when they're very convinced about this transgender phenomenon, they think they have to proselytize about this, is a very dangerous endeavor. The people who are attracted to proselytizing this stuff are typically a little bit spicy as individuals themselves. So it just instinctively makes sense to keep them away from the children.
Yeah, the left kind of acts like Captain Planet for grievances. So they're always going to be looking for the next beacon call for whatever. And you can imagine that one of the grievance cohorts they haven't dealt with yet is kids saying, I don't want to do the chores. I don't want to go to bed at this time. And I don't want, and so you're going to see, and I've said this for years, that in a few years, you're going to have Nancy Pelosi and these people advocating for like lowering the voting age down to younger and younger and younger. They'll get it to 12, younger, whatever they can, like, because that'll be the next point of division that they have to upend. And of course, Jesus alluded to this when he said father against mother and daughter against husband, and all this stuff, all these divisions that cut through the core of differences and differentiation and hierarchy are what's going to be inevitable in these stages of society that we're in. So it's kind of interesting how it all is coming to fruition.
And the thing is that in a way they have a point. Like, the age of consent, 18, what is the difference between someone who's, 17 years and 364 days old, and then the next day, does something change? This is the leftist argument that, these limits are essentially arbitrary, that, there's not really, some children mature earlier, who are you to say that this is the limit that needs to be imposed? And this argument essentially dismantles pretty much any sort of boundary, social boundary that you can, because they're pointing out something that it is in some ways is real, but the conclusion shouldn't be we need to abolish limits. It's that even if in some sense arbitrary, limits are necessary. So I think that's kind of the pushback that they're getting from people that are now kind of are in more of the deeper right. So they're saying, okay, the fact that you don't agree with our transcendent standard doesn't mean that that transcendent standard is something that you can dispense with, and that all hell lies beyond the abolishing of all limits, of all boundaries. Which is essentially kind of what's at the core. And like I said, they have a certain point with that. It's if you're going to put your rationalist hat on, there really isn't that much difference between a 17-year-old and 18-year-old. They're different amongst themselves. Some are more mature, some are less mature. So it's it makes sense from a rationalist perspective. But the reality is that we don't live in an exclusively rationalist world. There are many more considerations to take into account when you develop a social system, and a lot of them are legacy systems that you're better placed to just leave alone because they work for a reason.
Mm-hmm. Why is it that the leftist establishment has a fixation on individualism and autonomous desire when it comes to matters of gender and sex, but they don't really care about extending that to other matters like the right to self-defense or the right to, you know, they're not excited about, you know, allowing individuals to freely express themselves if the EPA wants to do something to their property, or eminent domain is not hot on the liberal project for the establishment left. They're not looking to fight against that, you know. Those are things that you don't hear about. The New York Times doesn't say, oh, this guy truly self-expressed themselves on their home, and then somebody took it, and the government took it, and they put a big a government project or a new sports arena. Um, you don't hear about that type of curtailment of individual desire, autonomous individual expression. You hear about it particularly when it relates to sexuality and sex and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially kind of the distinction between friend and enemy. You know, my friend's predilections are wonderful. Your predilections are devious and sinful. Therefore, you know, all principles go out the window. I think, you know, one of the kind of the, in a way, the sins that, you know, conservatives usually show is that they don't necessarily understand the fact that, you know, liberals aren't very principled. They're mostly sticking to this difference between who is my friend, and my friend is someone who is, you know, sexually liberated, who wants to you know, just uncover kind of the authenticity in this psychological realm where they constantly discover layers to their own personality, but they're also, you know, extremely concerned about nature, but in a very narrow sense, you know, kind of a I don't know, kind of the scientific carbon type of obsession. You know, they watch TED Talks. There's a certain type of person that's very clear in the liberal mind that is a friend, and everything outside of that Venn diagram circle is enemy. And it's you know, it's kind of like that. You know, I know it when I see it type judgment, where, you know, I know a friend when I see him. I know what's outside of the friend circle, and, you know, arming yourself is not in the friend circle, even if it's a kind of an act of autonomy, because also it, you know, it infringes on the rights of other protected classes, you know, of the rights of criminals, which, as we know, criminality is just a social dysfunction that comes from oppression and poverty, which is typically the fault of the enemy. So the enemy is not really in a position to defend himself if he is actually the prime cause of the dysfunction that targets him. Like, for example, you know, in I know, crime-ridden neighborhoods, you know, it's poverty, and who caused the poverty? You know, the enemy caused the poverty. Who caused the oppression? The enemy. You know, he is racist, he's homophobic. You know, there's oppression. There's, you know, the people on the street, you know, shooting up drugs. They probably were traumatized in homes of maybe conservative Christians. You know, like the family in Footloose. You know, this is kind of the imagination of the liberal. So when someone gets targeted by crime, you know, it's not really the criminal's fault. It's a social dysfunction that is downstream from the actions of the enemy. So it's very coherent.
From their
But, you know,
imagination, from their
yeah,
feelings.
it's exactly.
Is that how they extend it for like the foreign victims of liberalism? You know, I'm thinking about the people of color in Afghanistan and Libya, and, you know, that are totally pulverized and blown to pieces and enslaved, and our government liberals in the State Department created ISIS and funded Al Qaeda in Syria, and all of the people of color that they've just torn to pieces. What does the liberal imagination do to that fact that they're voting for Clintons and Obamas and Bidens that do that stuff over and over and over again? How come they don't do that whole George Floyd emotional moment for the people that are destroyed in Afghanistan? Is it simply because the elites and the TV doesn't tell them to do that? Like if they took a victim, like you remember the last drone strikes that Biden did, and he stupidly killed some innocent like aid worker and his family. Like if the New York Times had taken those kids' faces and then they made the logos and they made the T-shirts, and then you know the
Yeah.
Soros people funded
But
those people walking in streets.
why
Would
would the New
that?
York Times do that?
I'm just saying, like, if they did that, right, that would make them care about them. Is that all that matters, or is
Yeah,
there a
but,
way
you
that
know,
they
there
function? Is there a way they mentally like deal with that another way without?
yeah. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but whenever there's like a very complicated element, like, for example, the beginning of COVID was one of these like
Mhm.
complicated events that people didn't really know who was friend, who was enemy. Like the online right were the first people to have masks. They were about containment and things like that. It was a strange time. So people didn't really know exactly how to attribute their outrage, how to
They're
position
tribal.
themselves
Yeah.
exactly. So it took a little bit of time to see where the battle lines would be drawn. And I feel like that's kind of the process. You need to see where the wind is blowing with your tribe, and then that's kind of where you allocate your outrage. I mean, that's why I'm saying the New York Times would never do that because Biden is friend. You say good things about friends, you say bad things about enemies, and even if you say slightly bad things about friends, you frame them in such a way that it's like, oh, look at this, this putz, oh, he made one mistake, it's okay, and then you actually use that actually as to funnel back into the good things that oh, see, he only made one mistake his whole presidency. Can you believe it? So there's it's quite a subtle art, but once you see it,
Right.
it's
Well, that's
there.
the New York Times, but what about the average liberal mind, though? Do they never wander over to the plight of those painful bombs and drone strikes that their liberal elites do? Do they don't think about it?
I don't think they see that. I actually, the way these conflicts were framed, especially like for example, Saddam, an extreme dictator. He was essentially kind of a Hitler figure. That's the trump card that you need to pull out for the liberal mind. They need to know who is Hitler, who are the Jews in every
Right.
situation,
Yeah.
and then when you say Gaddafi is Hitler. Trump is Hitler. The Kuwaiti children don't have incubators. You need to kind of have one of these extremely vivid events that you put out there, and then you point your fingers towards the person who is the
Yeah.
Hitler, and then that lets all the framing fall into place. All the dominoes are fallen
So
into the
when
exact.
kids are sacrificed, it's sacrificing the cause of trying to liberate those kids from the big bad Hitler.
Of course,
Right.
women's rights. Women's rights is a great, lever to pull now. For example, in Afghanistan, it's all about women's rights. Why continue to be in Afghanistan? Why go to Afghanistan?
Well, who's the Hitler figure in their pandemic group think? Because Trump was the one that pushed the warp speed, and then you've got people putting this injection into 6-month-old babies as if they're doing a sacrificial, like, look at me, I'm willing to sacrifice my baby's skin in the game to show how obedient I am to the narrative. But it was that product was developed by their Hitler character there.
They
So how does
forgot
that
about
work?
it very fast. It was the Biden
They
vaccine.
forgot that he did it.
Yeah, they forgot. They forgot that they conveniently forgot that he did it because it wasn't Pfizer that actually pushed out the release date so that it wouldn't be associated with the Trump presidency, but
Yeah.
with the incoming Biden presidency. So everyone knew whose vaccine this was supposed to be, and then once Trump was out of the picture, it was clearly the Biden miracle cure that needed to be injected in any breathing
Do,
human.
do you think if he had been reelected that and they had gone through with the vaccine thing that they would be more against it?
That
Because they were
that is a
signaling that they were
definite
going to do that.
possibility.
Remember,
That
Kamala Harris was saying, "I'm not going to take that Trump vaccine," and Biden was talking about it's sketchy and stuff. So, would they have stayed that way, or do you think because the liberal mind tends to be very pro CDC and FDA by default? So that would be a weird conundrum. Where do you think the elites would have settled their minds into on
Yeah,
that?
I mean, I think this goes quite upstream. It would have probably influenced CDC and FDA policy in itself. So there might have been, a rejection of the Trump vaccine. So whatever strain was they were working on and saying, oh no, this is a shitty vaccine. We need to build this. I don't know. They would have glommed onto a slightly different product and said, okay, this is the one. This is
This is a woke
the red
vaccine.
vaccine. Yeah, wrong vaccine kills everyone. This is good vaccine, blue vaccine, tribe vaccine.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
need to use this one. So I'm sure there would have been a vaccine, but it would not have been the one that Trump was endorsing, the one that Trump was
Interesting.
working on.
Huh.
So
It's
yeah,
interesting.
that's my feeling.
Yeah, I mean, it's
What would
interesting
have
to do
happened.
those thought experiments to see how this worldview functions when it has different factors at play. Like I imagine if Trump, when he was running against Hillary, if he had picked up photos of children who Hillary Clinton's foreign policy had maimed or mutilated or killed, and just like shown photos and said, Hillary, this is like, how would that have fried the liberal emotive framework? Because they're all about caring for the underdog and caring for the other. And if Trump had used that rhetorical device, would that have fried their whole left versus right thing? Or do you think they would just block it out and say, I don't care if it's a dead baby of color that Hillary Clinton killed, that he didn't, that he's saying this is wrong, he's bad, so therefore hit that child's life, I'm not going to allow that to emotionally connect to me? Is that how they would do that? Or
Yeah,
how
I
fluid is
think
their emotional solidarity, like in terms of, can it go on to causes that their enemies, uh and I'm talking about the average person here, not the
yeah.
elites that are pushing these narratives, you know?
Yeah, I think it's hard to do that. I think, like, for example, if Trump would have showed up to one of his speeches with pictures of dead children, they would have said, "Oh, he's out of line. This is grotesque. Who does that? And they would have diverted it instantly to the fact that this is not statesmanly, like they did with many 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 of his acts. What he did fairly well was use language in that way, in a very kind of colorful, evocative way. But yeah, I think he probably could have done a bit more with images. I mean, you see how images are extremely politically salient, and they've
Yeah.
been like George Floyd. That's an image. It's a video. There was that picture of the boy stranded on the beaches of the Mediterranean, which essentially kind of completely galvanized the refugee crisis a few
Right.
years ago. So there's a lot. I mean, Wuhan, people collapsing in Wuhan. That's essentially what kicked off the biggest part of the obsession with COVID. So all of this stuff is extremely powerful. I don't know if I know liberals know how to use this stuff. I don't know if there's a sophisticated enough operator with these types of images on the right, or if
It's not that hard, really. I mean, in theory, right?
yeah,
The
it does.
right tends to want to go default to, we are the people of, we are all about facts, not feelings. So we're not going to show the pain and suffering of a kid because that would be a liberal thing. And we don't want to pander and be like them. We're all about facts and being ornery and angry and stuff. So they aesthetically don't go for that typically. I mean, they do it a little bit, like they did the angel moms, people who'd had kids killed from, undocumented illegal aliens or whatever, like they did that thing, but they don't know how to do it as well. That aesthetic of the victim.
Yeah, and it's a bit harder because it's kind of like the Democrats are the real racists. That frame doesn't work because it plays into the hand of the left. Like the real racists are who the left say the real racists are,
Right.
because they invent the category of racism. They
Right.
define the parameters around what is racist
Right.
and what is not. So who is the real victim is a hard card to play for the conservatives, because again, the Democrats essentially define what is a victim, and they've been doing that very professionally for a very long time.
But see, that
So
that opens up an interesting thought that I wanted to ask you about, is that, okay, so if that's the case, you don't want to do the just cheap ripoff of what the left does, but I would say that the left is a cheap ripoff of Christianity. So you don't want to do a cheap ripoff of a cheap ripoff, but how do you get the authentic center back? Because I would say that, like from a Rene Girard influence perspective, he talks all the time about Christianity reveals the scapegoats. It reveals the others. It reveals, I mean, your show, right? Subversive is about misfits and contrarians, and similar to what I do on this show. So there is within that space the authentic voice of the victim, the authentic voice of the scapegoat, somewhat, that I think we have to be careful. And I know maybe we can unpack this. Uh, is like, how do you walk that line? You don't want to be a ripoff of a ripoff, but at the same time, you don't want to like negate the opportunity in a mimetic way. Like, well, because the left so does victim narrative so well, I'm not going to touch that. But it's like, no, actually, that they got that from the Christian energy and the aesthetic and ethics that they inherited from Christianity. And if we are really going to stand strong on like a worldview that has a positive assertion to say, like, no, we're actually the defenders of victims, and it doesn't matter whether you fraudulently are, we're going to take that high ground back. Can you do that on the non-left space?
yeah, I mean that's the question. Can we do that? And I mean, we do kind of have the moral high ground, in the sense that there's more context to being a victim than being from a victimized group. Because I feel like the perspective that the left has on what it is to be a victim is essentially kind of demographic. It's like, okay, you belong to victim group X. You know, what the right can present is something that, you know, kind of brings back in that kind of hero's journey component. You know, there's you know, that concept of the deserving poor. There's kind of a virtue tied into it, because people who are on the right and present themselves as victims aren't victims because, you know, they tick a box on a form. They're, you know, actually you know, actually have been victimized by life in a tangible way. You know, that's essentially kind of the core of the right wing, that level of responsibility. I don't think the mainstream culture that exists right now is responsive to that narrative as much. I think people on the right are, and I feel like the numbers of people on the right are growing. But I feel like I said, you know, someone who's in the mainstream, you know, Joe Normie, or I guess in this case Jane Normie mostly, you know, watching a BLM rally like that is very sensitive to kind of the tick box exercise, you know. Element of who's a victim, who's not a victim. So I think there's a good chance of recalibrating people's senses of what a victim is, but I feel like it's a long journey, and it's not going to be as direct as, you know, just saying, oh, we are the real victims, because they don't believe it. It's in the sense like, okay, you can only be a victim within these parameters. You know, are you black? Are you disabled? Are you a trans woman of color? Whatever. These are the parameters set out for victims that we've, you know, gotten from headquarters, and that's how we're going to measure you. So I think that's kind of the narrative challenge that the right has, is that, you know, we just don't look like victims. We look like oppressors, and people have been indoctrinated that, you know, we're oppressors for a very long time, and it's hard to recalibrate that taste of people.
So what do you think is the path to victory towards that? Is it, you know, are the normies accepting the mainstream liberal framework of victimism because it's cool, because it seems to be the most morally high ground, or because it's just the most powerful? I mean, I know those are kind of like not necessarily mutually exclusive, but what do you think is the real draw there that the non-leftist among us would do well to learn from and maybe develop its own cultural strength in? Is it to be develop that coolness? I mean, you were recently, speaking of cool, you guys were in Vanity Fair recently, right? Weren't you quoted in Vanity Fair?
Yeah, we guys. Yeah.
The
I
new
don't know what
right,
it's called.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the new right. I think, yeah, Curtis Yarvin and a few other people. Yeah,
Yeah, I saw
it's
that article. I'm like, everybody on this, Blake Masters, Curtis Yarver, all these people are on my show. I mean, what's going on here? Are we in the cool nexus now? I don't know. It made me wonder, are we all feds? Because why would we be featured so
yeah,
positively in the
exactly.
Vanity Fair?
I mean, I think even if they tried to make a more destabilizing article, it wouldn't have worked, because, you know, essentially the second day that came out, everyone was just pointing at each other. Are you a Fed? Are you a Fed? Are you a Fed? So it's yeah, it's hard. You know, I think people are they're paranoid for a reason, because there actually are feds. I mean, I don't know who is a fed. My spidey senses are not very well calibrated, but there definitely are. You know, I mean, there's that you know, poster Ricky Vaughn. He's still in prison for, you know, posting a meme essentially. So there's serious activity. I mean, the January 6th protesters in prison. You know who knows what exactly is happening with them. So this isn't a strange paranoia. I think people are right to worry. But yeah, it was interesting to see that, you know, some people think this is cool. I'm not in those circles. I live in, like, you know, small town Romania. I just don't go to the parties where this is cool. But yeah, it's an interesting development. I mean, what I think is going to probably move the needle is closer to this becoming cool than to us convincing, you know, small town America. Because like you saw, you know, if the people on, you know, in the places where you know, the place that move the needle in a way, in the sense, you know, DC, New York, things like that, you know, London, Paris here in Europe, what they think essentially goes. And if what they think doesn't go, they're going to manipulate procedural outcomes in such a way that what they think goes. So it's, they might still keep a veil you know, of showiness above whatever they're trying to do, but it's not clear that people won't notice. So I think the reality is that if enough elites migrate to a different perspective that is sufficiently different, because I think
What do you
that's
mean
kind of the
elites? You
problem.
mean like actual elites behind the scenes, or do you mean like the cool characters that people are supposed to emulate in culture?
Yeah, I think
You know?
there's a little bit of overlap there, but I know what
Yeah.
you mean. I mean, like, there are people who are have a lot of financial interest invested in the current system. So
Like
those will be harder to move.
I had
But
a weird moment when I saw like this. You got this show, the Red Scare podcast, right?
yeah,
And I listen in, and they're talking about Renee Girard and seed oils. I'm like, wait a second, that's what I did. Why is this happening in New York City? What's going on here? I thought this was the weird. Like I thought I was out, and now, and then I saw this. I don't remember the name of that actress, Olsen, and she played as the witch in the Marvel comic movies. Elizabeth Olsen.
Elizabeth Olsen,
and
yeah.
and she said, "Oh, I love the." They asked her, "What's her favorite podcast?" And she's like, "Oh, I love the Red Scare." And I'm like, "Wait a second, this is strange. Here's a Marvel," and she's listening to a podcast that talks about Curtis Yarvin and Renee Girard and seed oils. I'm like, what? There is a kind of strange thing happening in that kind of cross section of the culture, where Hollywood stars that are in the mainstream normie, safe culture are tuning in to ideas that are considered to be underground and in some cases evil, right?
Yeah,
Right.
I think the worry here is that there's obviously a lot of energy coming out of this space because we essentially, we and the guest on my show, the guest on your show, we point out that the emperor is naked in very subtle and sophisticated ways that people have never heard of, because essentially what we've been doing is sitting on forums and in threads and
Yeah.
just you know developing this stuff for decades, and now it's out in the open. Like Curtis Yarvin is out in the open. This is stuff that people were reading about 10 years ago, like in hush tones, and talking amongst themselves in the Bay Area about this crazy anonymous guy, and now it's out in the open, and it's so different, so jarringly different and sophisticated and incubated from what's going on in the mainstream, that is almost inevitably going to attract a lot of attention, because a lot of it is right, and it is incontrovertibly, visibly, you can feel it in your bones, correct, and it's completely revolutionary as well. So it's impossible to ignore, and it's going to attract a lot of energy. The problem now is going to be, can this energy that's being attracted by this attention be diverted back into the mainstream? Because that's probably the main pressures that are going to be applied to the space now. It's like, okay, we're going to, you're going to get your talk show on the Federalist or something. You're going to, be trying, they're going to try to draw you into the David Frenches of the world, essentially kind of,
Institutionalize
can
these
they,
ideas or something, flatten
exactly,
them
can
out.
they make you liberal? Can they pull NRX into being liberal? Can they pull all of this, the spiciness in here, into something that is entertaining but defanged, that's actually not going to? Because the problem with these ideas is that if you really take them literally, if you take them at their word, they're revolutionary. They have to essentially change the status quo in a very deep way. Essentially, Curtis Yarvin is a monarchist. That might change things a little bit. It might shake things up if this stuff is actually taken seriously. If it's taken as entertainment, then it's not taken seriously. It's fluff. It's something that is going to generate some more, sinecures for people in media, and more fodder for things like the New York Times to, throw a fit over and say, oh, the new fascism rising on the horizon, blah 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 blah. So
Is the fact that it's in Vanity Fair with positive coverage? Is that a sign that they view it as a court jester, like Ricky Gervais?
Yeah, I
You
mean,
know?
it might be, or they're trying. I mean, because if you call something a court jester many times, it might just be one, because what they're presenting it as in that article is that, oh, this is cool, the kids like this. This is an affectation. This is a scene. It's not a revolutionary political movement. It's already kind of defanged by the time it's in the article. It's like, oh, all the cool kids like this guy. Oh, he's a little bit fash. It's already not a thing once it's there.
Mm-hmm. So that is kind of a tactic of turning it into a fashion rather than a worldview, and kind of defanging it that way. This is just an aesthetic. This is just an image.
Exactly.
They're
Yeah.
not
And
really. There's nothing really to living a traditional life with a husband and wife and kids. That's just kind of it's a scene that you put on, like when you go and buy records because you're tired of digital downloaded music and you want to get a record like the kids before you used to do, right?
exactly. The most edgy hipsters nowadays read Julius Evola and I don't know, listen to strange podcasts.
And so but you're saying that's the pathway to success, right? Is to adapt that. That's the only way the mainstream is going to take it. But then the question is, how much of its soul is going to be lost in the process? Is the question, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's the question. You want the elite to upload your software, your virus, and to play it. But I guess the question is what parts of it are going to be adopted, and if it's just adopted as a fad, then it's not really. You essentially almost kind of played yourself because you've shot your gun too early, and you've missed the actual war. You've just did some fireworks before the happening. So yeah, I think that's probably the question. I personally don't believe it's going to, nothing's really going to work just on the basis of populist energies and things like that. If there's no actual counter elite motivated enough to make actual change in the direction of these ideas, then we're just doomed to more and more podcasts. Not that podcasts are a bad thing. I love podcasts. I'm a podcaster myself. But yeah, a man cannot live by podcasts alone. And that's kind of the direction that I hope we're moving in. More action.
Well, it may be the preachy side of me, but I think unless we recover the heart and soul of Christianity, I don't think any of these things will end up anything other than a skin option on your metaverse character that you can don the trad character in your little metaverse world.
Yeah. Yes, I'm beginning to agree with you more and more. It's yeah, I mean it's been a long road, but yeah, it feels like, there cannot be any progress on this without a powerful competing metaphysics that has power from a source outside of itself, because it's not just like you cannot show up with like a rationalist 10-point plan, like this is my manifesto, let's implement it, on what authority, where the sovereignty lie in your program. It doesn't. So to be honest, there's not really anything outside of Christianity that could accomplish what needs to be accomplished.
Yeah. I think so much of internet culture on the right is people trying to create a new program better than Jesus because they're jealous and they're embarrassed. They're embarrassed too because Jesus represents their grandparents, and it's like I don't want to bring people don't want to bring grandma on their podcast and say, well, just listen to her. So they feel the need to have to come up with all these clever little new isms and new flavors and aesthetics and all this stuff, and they'll mention Christianity as like a part of that package, but it's this thing, and it's like, no, just do what he did and like focus on that, and that's too grandma. They feel like that's just too embarrassing. They can't do it.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something with that. Yeah, people do tend to feel like they need to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, we need a king. We have one. That's what I told Curtis. I mean, he said he wanted a king. I said we already have a king, and we got to play by his rules. But that's not fashionable yet. Hopefully we can make that cool with, well, we've done that in the past and it didn't work out in the church. So we have to be careful when we do it again, maybe.
Yeah, you don't want the church to be too cool in some ways. Yeah.
Well, Alex, I really appreciate your time, and I want people to check out your article on AmericanMind.org, Court Jesters, for reference to what we've talked about today, and also your Substack, which you can find alexkaschuta.com, right? It has your Substack link there.
Yeah, definitely. It's all
Very,
there.
very good. Thanks for your time.
Cheers. Thank you so much.